This is week 5 of MGT 6154. And the topic that we have this week is essentially all about project budgeting. Week 5, project budget is these developed budget artifacts. Here, the cost management plan, the procurement management plan, and activity procurement cost performance, and the cost performance baseline, which is a project budget. So I'll cover all those in the presentation. The one thing to note about procurement is the PMI changed their view on procurement a little bit, and they have moved it into what they call a organizational function or feature. Basically, what that means is they finally recognize the fact that most companies have a purchasing department or a procurement department, but so most of the stuff that we would normally have to do in execution phase in monitoring and controlling and managing the procurements has kind of moved over in there. But the project still is responsible for figuring out what it needs and communicating that and making sure that work gets done and deliverables are met and all of that sort of thing. So from a planning perspective, we're still kind of in that planning perspective. It doesn't change much. They call it a sourcing strategy. So they've changed the word from procurement to sourcing. It's essentially what they've done. But this course and this project's all based on the current PMBOK. But like I say, it doesn't really change much. It's more when we get over into the execution part of it. And then our job becomes mostly coordinating with this organizational function. And essentially what they've done is they've added a layer of collaboration that we need to do with that group. And it's been a long time since I worked on a project where we had to worry about the entire procurement process anyway, where, the project was responsible for soliciting contracts and getting bids and doing all that work. And then making sure that people get paid and all that. That's kind of been off-source, but it's still an important part of planning, and that's what we'll talk about here. So let me switch there we go. So the topic this week is, as I mentioned, developing project budgets and integrating cost planning. And so we're going to focus on how budgeting translates planning decisions into the financial foundation for project delivery and control as we go further. And this week's examines how project budgeting integrates planning decisions into an approved financial structure that supports later execution and control. And we're going to focus on how project budgeting is developed as part of an integrated project planning process. And we'll begin by looking at project delivery costs in context, and then examine how budget development connects scope, schedule, resources, procurement, and management decisions into this financial structure. And then we'll turn to the week 5 budgeting artifacts, and we'll talk about the cost management plan, the role of procurement planning in project budgeting, the development of activity and procurement cost estimates, and the creation of cost performance baseline. And we'll also talk a little bit about the importance of a time phase budgeting and something called a performance measurement baseline, since the baseline becomes much more useful when it supports this later monitor control rather than just as a total budget figure, and it'll have that time aspect to it. And then we'll connect everything to the week 5 course project and deliverables and take a little peek at week 6. Project delivery costs is the financial expression of scope, schedule, resources, and procurement decisions. So we begin with a simple but important idea that project cost is not just a number added at the end of planning. It's a financial expression or a financial picture of the project as a whole. Once the project team begins defining scope and organizing activities, identifying resources, and working on that procurement strategy, those decisions start to take on cost implications. So in other words, cost is connected to the work of the project intends to perform. And if the scope expands, costs usually expand with it. If activities require more time, specialized labor, equipment, or purchase services, the budget is also affected. And that's why project delivery costs should be understood as an integrated outcome of all these planning decisions rather than just a separate administrative task. This also helps explain why budgeting matters in project delivery. A project may be strategically valuable and well scoped, but if its financial requirements are not realistic, incomplete, or poorly coordinated, we can have execution problems, which will follow. So cost planning helps establish whether the project is, number one, financially feasible, what trade-offs may be necessary, and how spending will later be monitored and controlled. This idea is important because the Week 5 course project moves from the scope and schedule planning into this budget development. And so you're not just estimating isolated cost, you're translating the planned project work into an organized financial structure that will support the later control and performance evaluation that we're going to be doing. Project budgets are developed by combining planning outputs into an approved financial structure. The next step is to look at how budgeting is actually developed. A project budget doesn't appear on its own, and it's not created simply by guessing some total number. It's developed by bringing together several planning outputs and translating them into a financial view of the project. The first input comes from scope planning. The scope artifacts identify what the project intends to deliver and what work is included. That gives the project team a basis for deciding what must be funded. The next important input is the schedule. The schedule helps show when activities will occur, which means it also helps show when labor, materials, services, and other expenditures are likely to. This is important because the project budgets are not only about total cost, but they're also about the timing of spending. Resource and procurement planning add further definition. Resource planning identifies the people, materials, equipment, or expertise needed to perform the project work. Procurement planning, and what in PMBOK 8 they call sourcing strategy, identifies any external goods or services that must be acquired. Together, these planning outputs define many of the project's major cost drivers. Once those inputs are available, the project team can begin estimating costs and aggregating them into a more complete project budget. At that point, budgeting becomes more than just a list of estimated expenses. It becomes that financial structure that will eventually support the approval of the project, governance of the project, and later control. We also have reserve decisions that are also part of this process because projects operate under uncertainty. And so budgeting also includes contingency thinking, and rather than assuming that everything will occur exactly as planned. And so what this means is that we'll have management and contingency reserves to worry about. Contingency reserves are things that come out of the risk management process. And we'll talk about that, I think, in a week or two. So we have the risk management process, and from that we identify risk responses, which become our contingency. And there's a cost to those responses, and so we have to allocate that into the budget. And we're not there quite yet because we're doing linear fashion. Normally we would be doing all this concurrently in a real life project. So we'll have that in there. We'll also have something called management reserves. Management reserves are for what I call unknown unknowns, which are things that we don't know about now, which might happen, and we don't know if they're going to happen or not. So like right now, we got this bad weather. There's no way I could have predicted that other than we know it's the season for it. But there's things that happen that just come out of the blue and we don't know about. And so we may want to leave a management reserve for that. And also management reserves sometimes are good when maybe your organization has a history of becoming over budget just because of things that happen. So put a management reserve. The contingency reserves come out of the risk because risk that we identify are risks that can be, and we analyze the probability and impact of that risk. And we take that probability and the impact in dollar terms, multiply those together to come up with an expected monetary value for that risk. And we add up all those expected monetary values for all the risks that we identify, and we apply them to our time phase budget. And that becomes our contingency reserve. But we don't need to worry about that just quite yet. The cost management plan statement defines how project costs will be estimated, budgeted, monitored, and controlled. So now that we understand that budgeting depends on multiple planning inputs, the next question is, how will cost activities actually be managed? And that's the purpose of the cost management plan. Sometimes it's presented in a simplified form as a cost management statement. And this artifact doesn't contain the full project budget itself. Instead, it explains how the project team will approach cost management across the project. In other words, it defines the rules, expectations, and methods that will guide cost estimating, budgeting, and control. A useful way, a cost management plan typically describes how costs will be estimated, how the budget will be developed, how cost information will be organized, how variances will be reviewed, and how cost performance will be monitored over time. It may also clarify roles and responsibilities, reporting expectations, and how cost changes will be handled if project conditions change. All this matters because cost discipline is difficult to achieve when teams move directly into estimating without first establishing a consistent management or estimating approach. And so without that structure, estimates may be inconsistent, budget assumptions may be unclear, and the later control activities may become more subjective or reactive than they should be. But for this course, you're not expected to produce a highly detailed enterprise level plan. The goal is to demonstrate that you understand the purpose of the cost management plan / statement and can define a practical sort of PMI approach for managing costs on your project. So finally, the cost management plan, the key takeaway here is the cost management plan helps distinguish between two related but different ideas. One is the cost management approach for cost, and the other one is the budget itself. The plan defines how costs will be managed and later provides the actual estimates in the baseline. So that's the difference between the cost plan and the other documents that we're talking about. A useful cost management plan establishes rules and expectations that makes cost planning and control consistent. So we've introduced the cost management plan as a governance artifact. And so now the next step is to clarify what it should actually address. A good cost management plan doesn't need to be overly long or highly formal, but it should provide enough direction to make cost planning and control consistent across the project. One important element is the estimating approach. The plan should explain how costs will be estimated and documented so the project team uses a consistent method for developing and presenting cost information. This creates better transparency and makes later review more meaningful. In other words, we're going to use bottom-up estimating, we're going to use analogous estimating for maybe these work packages, just kind of at a high level, just what, bottom-up estimating. So just at a high level, describe what that means. And that's for the project team to use guidance. Now, in real life, you might even have probabilistic type estimating, scenario type estimating where you have simulations and all that sort of thing. We're not going to go into that deep, but the main point here is that you just need to address that up front because you don't want similar work to be estimated differently. And that makes it much more difficult to manage later on when you're trying to manage the actual delivery of the project. The plan should also explain how the budget will be structured and approved. And that includes how these estimates will be organized, how they'll be aggregated to the budget, and who has authority to review and approve cost-related decisions. This is important because budgeting is not just a technical exercise, it's also a governance activity. So we need to build into the plan who can approve and how that works. Sometimes the way I've seen this done, it says the project manager can approve anything up to a certain dollar amount or a certain percentage of the budget. And then after that, it has to be the sponsor or maybe the change control board or whoever has the ultimate authority for the budget, for funding mostly. Another key area is performance monitoring and reporting. The plan should define how cost performance will be reviewed once the project is underway, including reporting approach, review timing, and the communication of cost status to decision makers and stakeholders. So this is a big part of what should be part of the communication plan eventually, is who needs to know what and what level, and that should all be addressed here as well. And you may want to talk about when we do monthly reviews, they're going to be daily reports, that kind of thing. And for the project, it's just real high level stuff. You can just do some search on the internet and find out some suggestions. And it should also explain how variance and cost-related changes will be handled. That kind of goes back to what I was saying about the project manager or someone being authorized to approve changes, budgets up to a certain point, because projects rarely evolve or unfold exactly as planned. So the team needs a shared understanding of what happens when costs begin to shift and when assumptions change or when corrective action is needed. The cost management plan should make accountability visible. There's an example format for this week. I think is a good reminder. I don't know if I have the format in there or not, but I think we have an example maybe in this presentation. I'm not sure, but you can go into PMI Infinity and ask for a sample cost management plan. For the course project, the goal is not to create a big bureaucratic document. The goal is to show how practical the document can be, how it defines that costs will be managed, and makes responsibility for those decisions clear. Procurement planning and project budgeting. Procurement planning, and now, as I mentioned, the PMBOK 8 calls that sourcing strategy. So similar, but just a little bit different. But procurement planning or sourcing strategy must be integrated into project budgeting because externally sourced goods and services shape both cost and delivery conditions. So after addressing how the costs are governed, the next step is to recognize that many project budgets are not built from internal labor and materials alone. Projects often depend on externally sourced goods, services, tools, contractors, or specialized expertise. And that's where the procurement planning becomes an important part of budget development, procurement planning or sourcing strategy. Procurement matters because it creates direct financial commitments. Once the project decides that something needs to be purchased, contracted, leased, or outsourced, that decision becomes part of the project's cost structure. In some cases, procurement costs may represent only a small portion of the budget. In other cases, they may define a major share of the total project cost. Procurement decisions also affect schedule and timing. A needed vendor may have lead times, contract review requirements, delivery constraints, payment milestones. All those things shape when work can begin and when costs will be incurred. This means procurement planning or sourcing strategy is not just about buying something, it's about integrating external sourcing decisions into the broader project plan. Another important part of this is the contract structure. Different procurement approaches create different financial and risk implications. A fixed price agreement, a time and materials arrangement, or another contract form may influence cost certainty, flexibility, oversight needs, and exposure to change. Because of that, procurement planning affects not only what the project spends, but also how confidently the project can manage cost. Procurement planning must also remain aligned with scope. The project should be clear about what is being acquired, why it's needed, and how it supports the project's deliverables and objectives. In other words, purchased items or services can become disconnected from the project priorities or create uncertainty and unnecessary spending if we are not aligned with the project scope. For the course project, you're asked to prepare the procurement management plan or statement as part of the budget artifact package, and it should reinforce important management principle like realistic budgets depend on integrating external sourcing decisions early rather than treating procurement as an afterthought. And if your project's not going to do any procurement, then it needs to be stated in an assertive sort of way so that if, for your course project, it's not a huge thing, but if you're in a big organization, you need to be explicit about your intentions there to do everything internally. The procurement management plan defines how the project purchase and external sourcing will be approached and evaluated and managed. So we're going to extend the last side a little bit more in here. Since the procurement affects the cost and delivery conditions, the next step is to focus on the artifact used to guide that work, the procurement management plan, or in its simpler form, the procurement management statement. That statement would be, we're going to do it or we're not. And if it's a small amount, you might be able to cover it all in the statement. This artifact explains how the project will approach external purchasing and sourcing decisions. It helps the team to clarify what goods and services will need to be acquired from outside the project, how those needs will be evaluated, and how procurement activities will be managed across planning and execution of the project work. A useful procurement management plan begins by identifying what must actually be procured. Not every project needs a significant external purchasing, but when procurements are involved, the project should be clear about what is being acquired and why it's needed. That helps connect procurement activity back to the scope and delivery needs of the project. The plan should also describe how vendors, suppliers, or contractors will be selected. This may include criteria such as cost, capability, availability, quality, experience, compliance requirements, delivery reliability. Even if the project uses a simplified forms, you should show that procurement decisions are intended to be thoughtful rather than arbitrary. And the same thing would apply to your course projects. Another important area is contract and sourcing considerations. The project may need to consider whether to buy, lease, contract, or outsource, as well as the type of purchasing arrangement that best fits the work. These decisions can affect cost predictability, flexibility, oversight needs, and risk exposure. One of the things that happens in a lot of the places where I've been, this is essentially taking what the company policy is and building it into your project plan. Most organizations, especially now that we have these purchasing organizations within the organization, will have policies on how all this stuff gets done. And so you don't often need to go and build a whole thing from scratch. You take what you have and adapt it to what you need. The procurement management plan should also make responsibilities visible. Someone must define the needs, someone must evaluate options, someone must approve and coordinate procurement activities. On many projects, procurement work is shared across project leadership, sponsors, and purchasing staff and other stakeholders. So clarity matters. And that goes back to building in the policies that you have available and only really documenting exceptions. And finally, this artifact supports coordination. Project planning should not sit apart from the rest of the project. It should align with the schedule, the budget, and the overall delivery approach. So external purchases support project execution rather than disrupt it. Our goal for the course project is not to create a real highly legalistic or procurement-heavy enterprise-type document. The goal is to show that procurement planning is a meaningful part of the project budgeting, and you can define a practical approach for managing it. The next slide here, procurement choices affect the cost realism through pricing, timing, and contract terms, and external dependency risk. So after identifying how procurement will be managed, the next issue is understanding why procurement decisions matter so much to the project budget itself. External purchases do more than add line items to our cost estimate. They shape the realism and the timing and the risk profile of the budget. And the first influence is pricing. Supplier quotes, labor rates, service package, equipment costs, and market conditions all affect the assumptions built into the budget. If those assumptions are weak or outdated, the budget can quickly become unrealistic. Lead times also matter. Procurement may require ordering, review, contracting, shipping, setup, or vendor scheduling before the project can use what it has purchased. Those timing factors can shift when project work occurs and when costs are actually incurred. Contract terms create another layer of impact. A fixed price agreement may increase the cost predictability, but reduce flexibility. A variable or time-based arrangement may allow adaptation, but create more cost uncertainty. These choices affect how confidently the project team can plan and control spending. Payment structures also shape the budget. Deposits, milestone payments, recurring fees, or final acceptance of payments affect cash flow and funding timing. So even when the total cost is known, the budget still needs to reflect when those costs must be covered. So we have to put in funding decisions into our budget as well. Finally, procurements also introduce external dependency and dependency risk. Vendor performance issues, supply delays, pricing changes, or contract disputes can all affect both cost and schedule. That's why procurement planning and budgeting need to stay closely connected. So what we've been talking about is a useful bridge to the next part of this, because procurement decisions are better understood when the team is in a stronger position to develop meaningful activity and procurement cost estimates. Cost activities translate planned activities and procurement needs into specific supportable financial assumptions. After examining how procurement decisions shape the budget, the next step is to estimate the actual cost associated with the project work. This is where the budget begins moving from planning logic into more specific financial assumptions. Activity and procurement cost estimates are the artifacts that capture those assumptions. For planned activities, estimates assign an expected cost to the work that the project team intends to perform. For procurement items, the estimates reflect the expected cost of externally sourced goods or services that the project will need in order to deliver project outcomes. All this matters because a budget can't be built directly from broad estimates alone. It needs underlying estimates that connect to actual activities, work packages, or procurement needs. In other words, the budget becomes more credible when it's supported by identifiable cost estimates rather than by a single undifferentiated total. Good estimates also include supporting assumptions and sources where possible. A labor estimate may be based on expected hours and rates. A procurement estimate may come from a quote, a catalog price, or a historical preference approximation. Even in a simplified course project, documenting that logic makes the estimate more transparent and easier to review. These estimates are also important because they become the inputs for later budget aggregation. And once the project team has estimated the relevant activities and procurement items, those numbers can be grouped into a broader project budget and eventually into a cost baseline. This cost baseline is one of the most practical artifacts that we have. It pushes the project from abstract planning into a more operational level of detail. The goal is not perfect precision, but a reasonable and supportive estimate structure that reflects the work and purchasing needs of the project. And on this slide also helps us distinguish between three related ideas. The cost management plan explains how costs will be managed. The activity and procurement cost estimates identify expected costs for specific work and purchases. And later cost performance baseline aggregates those estimates into an approved time phase baseline. Reliable cost estimates depend on using estimation approaches that fit the project's information, uncertainty, and decision needs. Once the project team begins developing activity and procurement cost estimates, an important question emerges. How should those estimates actually be produced? Not all estimates are created in the same way, and not all estimates carry out the same level of precision or confidence. That's why the estimating approach matters. And that's why we would document this in our cost management plan. In some situations, especially early in planning, the project may rely on broader approximations. And when information is limited, the team may use prior experience, analogous comparisons, vendor references, or rough scaling logic to estimate what work is likely to cost. These approaches can be useful, but they should be understood as less precise. What happens a lot of time in real life, you'll be asked to provide an estimate on an activity and somebody will say, well, that's 8 hours. Well, if it's early in the process, that could be correct plus or minus some order of magnitude, 50 to 150%. There's a concept called the cone of uncertainty that depicts this. And it shows that early in the project, we're usually really way off with our estimates, and we don't get into where we can do a good reference type estimate, one we can use for planning as more time goes by. And it shows how that uncertainty affects that. But it sort of explains this as the scope becomes clearer and activities get better defined, the project can usually estimate with greater detail. So that explains that cone of uncertainty. At that point, the team may be able to assign expected quantities, hours, rates, materials, or procurement values more directly. The estimate becomes stronger because it's tied more closely to the actual structure of the work. This is why estimate credibility depends not only on the number itself, but on whether the estimating method fits the level of information available. A detailed looking number can create a false confidence if the underlying definition is still vague. On the other hand, a broader estimate can still be reasonable if it matches the project's current level of certainty. And the uncertainty in this process also matters. Projects rarely operate under perfect conditions, so the team should think about how much confidence the estimate deserves and what assumptions are driving it. This is especially important for procurements where supplier pricing, timing, and contract conditions may still be developing. For the course project, though, you don't need to produce advanced enterprise estimating models. The more important thing is to show that cost estimates are reasonable, tied to the work, and supported by an approach that aligns with the information that you have available. In other words, we want to support the concept that strong estimates are just not numbers, they're informed judgments supported by methods and assumptions. The next step is to bring these individual estimates together into the project budget and baseline. Project budgets are built by aggregating validated cost estimates into a coordinated financial view of the project. Once the team has developed activity and procurement cost estimates, the next step is to bring these estimates in together into a broader project budget. This is an important transition because individual estimates by themselves do not yet provide a complete financial picture of the project. Budget development begins by organizing the estimates into a coordinated structure. Activity costs, procurement costs, and other relevant planned expenditures need to be grouped in a way that reflects how the project will actually be funded and managed. This gives the team a more complete understanding of the total expected cost. At the same time, budgeting is not only about adding numbers together, the project team also needs to consider when costs are likely to occur. Some costs happen early, such as startup purchases, deposits, or initial labor commitments. Other costs occur later, such as activities progress, deliverables are completed, or vendors reach payment milestones. That's why a useful budget reflects both cost, magnitude, and cost timing. This aggregation process helps reveal whether the project estimates work together realistically. A project may have reasonable individual estimates, but when those estimates are viewed together, issues can emerge. The total may exceed expectations. The timing may create funding strain or constraints, or assumptions across estimates may not align. Budget development helps expose those issues before execution begins. And this is also where estimates begin to take on a governance significance. Once the individual cost estimates are organized into a broader project budget, the project is closer to creating a baseline that can be reviewed, approved, and later used for monitoring control. The estimate list is not the final product. It's an input to the larger budgeting process. And the real goal is to turn these individual financial assumptions or estimates into a coherent budget that supports management approval and future performance evaluation. The cost performance baseline establishes the approved time phrase budget used to monitor and control project cost performance. Once estimates have been aggregated into the project budget, the next step is to establish the cost performance baseline. This is one of the most important outputs of week 5 budgeting work because it turns the budget into something that can be actually used for project control. So it's one of our 3 baselines that we have. We have the scope baseline, the cost baseline, and the schedule baseline. And we can later kind of merge all those together into something that we call a performance management baseline and use that for monitoring and governance. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here in a minute. The key idea is that the baseline is not just a total cost number. It's an approved budget that's distributed across time. In other words, it reflects the planned spending as the project moves through its activities, procurements, and delivery milestones. That time phase structure is what makes the baseline useful later when the team begins comparing actual performance against the plan. And another thing we want to include here is not just when costs occur, but when funding is needed or when payments need to be made. This matters because project cost control depends on having a reference point. If the project only has a rough total budget, it's difficult to tell whether spending is aligned with expectations at a given point in time. The cost performance baseline gives the team a structured basis for asking whether the project spending is more or less than planned and whether corrective action may be needed. The baseline also connects budgeting to later performance measurement. Once the actual cost data begins to accumulate, the project team can compare what was planned to what was actually occurred. And that comparison supports variance review, cost reporting, and eventually more advanced performance analysis like earned value analysis. It's an important distinction. The estimate list identifies expected costs for specific work and procurements. The project budget aggregates all these estimates into a total number. The cost performance baseline takes that budget and turns it into a control reference for the project. For the course project, it doesn't need to be an overly complex baseline. Again, everything is high level and simple, but it should show an understanding of the core idea that project budgeting becomes more useful when it's structured as an approved baseline that supports later monitor control. We'll talk about the importance of a time-phased budget. The time-phased budget creates the baseline need for meaningful cost control and broader performance measurement. The importance of a cost baseline is not simply that it's approved, its real value comes from being time-phased. The project does not just need to know how much it expects to spend overall, it needs to know how spending is expected to unfold across the life of the project. The time-phased budget structure makes cost control much more meaningful. When actual spending is compared to a time-phased plan, the project team can see that not only whether the project is over or under budget, but also whether the spending is occurring earlier, later, or differently than we expected. It creates much better visibility into cost performance or overall project performance. This is important because cost problems often begin as timing problems, sequencing problems, or variance patterns before they appear as a final budgeting problem. A time-phased budget helps surface those patterns earlier and supports a more informed corrective action. It also provides a broader performance measurement. In many project environments, especially those using earned value concepts, the approved time-phased budget contributes to what's often called the performance measurement baseline, or the PMB. That term is commonly used when scope, schedule, and cost performance are integrated into one baseline structure for monitoring project performance. For this course, we don't need to build a full earned value system, but we should understand that it's a time phase cost baseline is more than a budgeting document. It's a planning foundation for later performance measurement and project control. So that's why all the week 5 artifacts matter. It helps us move our course project from static cost planning into something more time-phased, more of a time-phased financial view of the projects. The week 5 project deliverables translate the project planning into a practical PMI aligned budgeting system. At this point, the major ideas of week 5 come together in the course project deliverables. The assignment's not asking us to submit several unrelated budgeting documents. It's asking us to show that they can build a connected, practical structure for real or realistic project. The cost management plan defines how costs will be managed. It establishes the project approach to estimating, budgeting, monitoring, and cost control. And in that sense, it provides the governance logic behind the rest of the financial artifacts. The procurement management plan adds an important dimension by addressing how externally sourced goods and services will be handled. And this is important because procurement decisions often affect both cost and delivery conditions, including timing, contract structure, and risk exposure. Activity and procurement cost estimates provide the detailed financial assumptions that support the budget. These estimates move the project from broad planning into more specific and supportable expectations about what activities and procurements are likely to cost. The cost performance baseline then organizes those cost expectations into an approved time-phase budget structure. That baseline gives the project a usable financial reference for later monitoring and control. So we take all these together. These artifacts form a budgeting system rather than a disconnected set of documents. And that's the deeper purpose of this part of the course project. We're expected to demonstrate not only that we understand each artifact, but also that we understand how the artifacts work together to support delivery. And this will be an important bridge to later project work. Once the project has a governed cost approach and procurement logic and credible estimates and a time phrase baseline, it's better prepared for control, change management, and performance measurement that we'll have in the course project coming up. So I want to look ahead a little bit at week 6. The artifacts developed so far become key inputs for governance, change, and control, and we'll develop the artifacts that we'll develop in week 6. This week's work is part of the larger progression across the course project. The artifacts developed so far form the project selection and scope through scheduling, budgeting, and procurement. These now become important inputs for the next major step in the life cycle, validating controls in week 6. In week 5, we developed financial structure of the project through cost planning, procurement planning, cost estimates, and cost performance baseline. Now those artifacts will help us define how project spending is expected to occur and create a reference point for later monitoring control. Now in week 6, we're going to shift towards governance and oversight. We'll begin documenting the project management processes that support control across the project, including communications, quality, risk, and change management. These artifacts will help explain how the project will stay aligned, how information will flow, and how risk will be addressed, and how quality will be supported, and how changes will be evaluated and managed. One especially important concept in week 6 is change management. Once a project has approved plans and baseline, changes to scope, schedule, or costs shouldn't be treated casually. The project needs a defined way to review, authorize, and integrate changes so that control remains disciplined rather than reactive. This means that the work we've completed becomes foundational for week 6. The project can't manage cost changes well unless it already has established how cost is planned, what the approved budget baseline looks like. And in the same way, governance and oversight become more meaningful when they are tied to real project plans rather than general intentions. So the larger message is that week 5 develops the project's budgeting structure. Week 6 builds on the control structure needed to govern that plan during execution. And together, these 2 weeks move the course project from planning into practical project oversight and into project execution. So managerial takeaways. The effective project budgeting, this is the conclusion side here. Effective project budgeting requires integrated planning, disciplined assumptions, and time-phased baseline that supports control. So to close out, the most important takeaway is that project budgeting should not be viewed as a narrow accounting task. It's an integrated planning activity that connects scope, schedule, resources, procurement, and management judgment into a financial structure the project can actually use. A second takeaway is that procurement matters more than we sometimes expect. External sourcing decisions can influence total cost, spending timing, flexibility, and risk exposure. That means procurement planning should be treated as part of budgeting, not as something separate from it. So we'll treat that sourcing strategy as part of our budgeting function. And procurement's one of these weird things that when you're trying to figure out what you need to do, you're sort of executing and planning at the same time. And so it's always been one of those things that's been difficult to position where you want to position it. I think the way the PMI has done it now with the sourcing strategy, by keeping most of the planning part of it as part of the cost function and moving most of the execution part of it into a organizational structure, will help a lot with governance and things like that. Another important lesson is that cost estimates should be reasonable and supportable. The goal is not perfect precision, especially in the course project, but estimates should reflect the work, the assumptions behind the numbers, and the level of information available. So credibility matters more than false precision. The time phase baseline is also a central concept, as the budget becomes much easier to monitor and control when planned spending is visible over time rather than expressed only as a one total number. That baseline supports cost comparison, variance review, and broader performance measurement later in the project lifecycle. So when we take all this together, the week 5 budget artifacts help create execution readiness as well as governance. They don't just satisfy an assignment requirement. They give the project a more disciplined financial foundation for approval, monitoring, and future decision making. So it's really the larger purpose of this week is learning how budgeting supports project delivery, not just how costs are listed. So that's the end of the presentation, just in the nick of time. And so we will call this one done. I'll see you all next week. Okay?
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Mhm.